Hello and welcome to session 2 of our Suicide Bereavement e-learning module. In this session, I'll be talking about the impact of suicide bereavement on children and adolescents. We will review the emotional, psychological, social, and educational impacts that this type of bereavement and grief have on children and adolescents. Specifically, we'll delve quite deeply into the emotional and psychological aspects of their experience and talk about what's maybe unique about bereavement by suicide as opposed to grief or bereavement in general. So, childhood bereavement to suicide is complex, with suicide bereaved children experience increased anxiety and depressive symptoms, and they're more likely to experience specific emotions that we'll go into in detail. So, feelings of loss, sadness, and loneliness are magnified in suicide bereavement by feelings of guilt, confusion, rejection, shame, anger, and the effects of stigma and trauma. Children and adolescents bereaved by and dealing with loss from suicide may face agonizing questions, intrusive public scrutiny, and need to cope with extra emotions such as guilt, shame, self-blame, again, trauma. A lot of kids bereaved by suicide experience trauma. Some adolescents may have known or suspected that the deceased person was feeling suicidal. If this is the case, the teen may feel they should have taken a conversation more seriously, told someone about their concerns, or done something to stop the death. And of course, if that's the thought process, they're going to experience a lot of guilt and potentially fear and withdrawal. So, how is suicide bereavement different from other forms of grief? Children who experience a suicide death exhibit elevated levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms and maladaptive grief comparable to children bereaved by anticipated deaths. And by anticipated deaths, I just mean deaths that they see coming. Essentially, if a family member was ill or you knew that someone only had a certain time period to live. Anytime you experience a death that comes as a shock, there's more trauma involved, and it's actually more difficult to cope with the emotions associated with that. Suicide bereaved children tend to experience more anxiety, anger, and shame, along with their depressive symptoms that you typically see with bereavement. So I'm going to run through some of the emotional and psychological effects of bereavement by suicide. So obviously, emotional distress, which we see in generally bereaved people, sadness, or that intense emotional pain associated with loss, hopelessness, confusion, or feeling overwhelmed, denial and numbness, shame and embarrassment, maybe even humiliation, really strong form, rejection or abandonment, and fear. You see a lot of fear because in this sense, and this is true of other forms of grief, but when we lose someone, especially by suicide, the world suddenly doesn't feel like such a safe place. So there's a lot of fears associated with this, fears and anxiety. So fears that someone else in their life could die, fears of being alone, or even sometimes being around a lot of people, not feeling safe. Fears of going to sleep because they can't get comfortable, they can't quiet their mind. Fears of being away from caregivers. So we see a lot of times if someone is, or if a child or adolescent is bereaved by suicide, they worry a lot about the surviving parent and may even, because they have sleep difficulties and worry about the parent, may want to sleep with that parent just to be comforted knowing that that parent is safe, that they're close, that kind of thing. They also experience a lot of anxiety, so anxiety about what will happen next in their lives. They might be hypervigilant about their immediate surroundings, like almost looking for possible threats or looking for what might harm them. Again, it intensifies their perceived vulnerability to harm. They'd be sensitive to changes, so any major changes in their life. They might be very reluctant or throw tantrums when changes are happening. They'd be sensitive to stories of other suicide deaths or news clips depicting suicide or talking about suicide, even things in the news about injustices in the world, because it almost intensifies that sense that the world isn't a safe place, that I could be harmed or mom could be harmed or what not. Just lacking that sense of security in the world now. There also would be quite a bit of anger. And this anger can be quite confronting and confusing. So they might feel angry with the person who died. They might be angry at the remaining or surviving parent. They could be even angry at themselves for not preventing the death. And you might even find that they get angry at God for taking this person away or not preventing the death. As they grow older, they may feel increasingly angry as they become more aware of how the loss has affected their life. And you do see this, there's a concept called regrief, and we see this in children especially that start hitting different cognitive developmental milestones. And when they do, they almost have this new understanding of the world and their life with more insight, deeper understanding. But if you've lost someone or if someone has died and they're no longer in your life, it makes you re-examine, oh wow, this is actually having more of an impact than I thought. And you see this in adolescence, especially going from, high school into adulthood and gaining more independence. They start thinking about, oh, dad's not going to be at my graduation. I didn't anticipate that. Like it wasn't their thought process when they were an early teenager, or dad's not going to be present at my wedding. So you kind of re-grieve that loss under these new circumstances and your new understanding of your life. There's a lot of guilt, or there can be a lot of guilt, like they should have done something or said something to keep that person from dying. They worry they weren't good enough or nice enough, and maybe if they were good enough or nice enough to the person who died, that maybe they'd still be around. And it's just obviously going to induce a lot of guilt. They may fear social stigma and the perceived judgment that they'll get from other people because of this death, just because suicide is somewhat stigmatized in our society. They might feel very lonely, and there's a large sense of isolation because a lot of people don't lose their parent to suicide. So you almost feel like, why me? I'm the only one going through this. And I'll talk a little bit later about a program that we've established for those who are bereaved by suicide called Let's Talk Suicide. And a lot of the purpose of that program is to reduce the stigma and also connect those people who have that experience with others so they don't feel so isolated and alone in that form of grief. They may have difficulty talking about their experience because either they don't understand it very well or they're so ashamed of what happened. Some children and teens may feel relief if the person who died really struggled with mental illness, maybe substance use or addiction, or even violent and impulsive behavior due to things like bipolar disorder. And that relief is often immediately followed by guilt for feeling almost a pleasant feeling of relief when you should be in emotional pain. So that guilt almost is a reminder, no, you should feel bad for feeling relieved. Although you should never feel bad about any emotions that come up because they're natural. And it's okay to feel a range and a mix of emotions. So relief would be natural to come up and shouldn't be stigmatized, or you shouldn't maybe place a value judgment on that. They may experience more physical health problems and, again, inability to sleep, more difficulty in family relationships, depending on what the impact was of that death. Obviously, that omits one caregiver, or If it is a sibling, that's a little bit different, but it changes the family dynamics and the responsibilities and roles of people in the family. And again, that those changes can be really hard for these kids to go through. Children who are survivors of parental suicide tend to experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, poor school performance, and decreased social adjustment than children whose parents died by natural causes. Child survivors of suicide have elevated rates of psychiatric disorders, including major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and actually panic disorder, which is a form of anxiety disorder. Adolescents bereaved by parental suicide have a 2 to 3-fold risk of dying by suicide. Parental history of suicide is actually a major risk factor for suicide in their offspring. There is an association between parental suicide and offspring psychiatric outcomes with the following results, according to one study. An increased risk for the development of suicide and bipolar disorder among child and adolescent offspring of those who've experienced parental suicide. A greater risk of psychiatric disturbance in offspring if parent suicide occurred at a younger age. So the younger it occurred, probably the more risk involved. Now that doesn't mean just because they're at risk, they're going to be suicidal or be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, such as a mood disorder like bipolar or major depressive disorder. It just means that they might be more predisposed, but it's not a destiny. So why is grieving especially difficult for young people after a suicide? They may have had no warning, as we talked about before, or the opportunity to say goodbye, which can lead to shock and greater disbelief for longer periods of time, and a lot of unanswered questions. An important part of grieving is finding meaning and then adjusting to a world without the deceased. Any death can be hard to understand. However, a suicide death is often much more difficult to understand, the why did this happen and what was going on for this person and how does this affect the rest of my life? How do I navigate the world? How do I regain a sense of safety and security in this world when something so heinous has happened? So yeah, it can be very difficult for them. Those who experience a death by suicide face stigma in our society, which can prevent them from seeking out support and healing resources. One study found higher incidences of rejection, blaming, shame, stigma, and the need to conceal the cause of death among those bereaved by suicide as compared with other causes of death. And of course, as we've seen, if you're isolated in your grief or you keep it a secret, it's much more likely to fester into some type of larger suffering or psychiatric disorder. Sometimes in suicides, the police are called. So police, procedures, press, just the involvement of a lot of strangers in something so intimate and private in the family's life often create complexities and make these children withdraw even more because they feel almost so violated that, here are these adults coming in, these strangers making such a big deal of this, and maybe they have really stern or sad faces, and it just creates a lot of confusion for these kids, and they get the message that all of this is just really difficult to deal with. So they may stop feeling comfortable and safe, and there may also be a delay in the release of the body of the deceased, which delays rituals crucial to the tasks of mourning. These mourning rituals help us navigate and move through our grief, processing it in ways, but not having, say, a funeral because the body needs to be examined and that kind of thing can just delay all of this for these kids. They may have difficult or shocking memories. A suicide can be very violent in certain cases and very shocking, especially for young people who may not even know what suicide is yet. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of kids that have maybe directly seen the event or were the first responder on the scene, and that creates quite a bit of trauma And a lot of these emotions would and psychological effects would be heightened in those people. Bereaved children may dread thinking about the person and try to avoid it whenever possible, just because of how difficult those emotions are that upwell when they think about them. So it just makes their grieving journey a lot more difficult. Another study outlined the characteristics of suicide bereavement that are qualitatively different than other forms of bereavement, that may lead to delays in survivors' healing. And these include the need to understand guilt, responsibility, or the felt sense of responsibility for the death, rejection, this sense of perceived abandonment, anger, stigma and taboo are reported, trauma associated, increased suicide risk, and complicated grief, because yes, this grieving journey is more complex and potentially more difficult for these individuals. Due to factors as genetics, learned behavior, their social environment, having a family die by suicide may put children at greater risk for suicidal thoughts. However, when children are able to express their emotions, have clear and consistent boundaries and routine, and get their cognitive and physical needs met, they're much more likely to thrive in the face of grief. Some indicators that children may need some professional support are if you start to see they lose interest in things they once liked, hobbies, or hanging out with certain friends that they used to be very close with, ongoing difficulty with sleeping, or even being a fussy eater or not eating as much or too much. It could be either. Engaging in high-risk behaviors, so for maybe adolescents getting into drugs or risky behaviors, and little children maybe not having as much mindfulness for their safety. Could be aggressiveness toward themselves or others, so we do see more self-harm in this group, so keeping an eye out for that. And any indication that they're having suicidal thoughts or even behaviors like suicide attempts. They may have different challenges at school, particularly with concentration and focus, kind of emotions coming on and overwhelming them without warning and having to kind of go see a school counselor for that. They might experience or even just perceive peer rejection and receive hurtful comments. It's really unfortunate. We get a lot of reports from kids grieving generally, but specifically by suicide, that say they've been bullied for it, partially because of the stigma, but yeah, again, highlighting that maybe they're the only one that has been through this, which is not true, but maybe in their school, the focus is really on them and their experience. And you might see a lot of tantrums and outbursts. So any of these things come up, it would be good to refer them to a professional. And I guess in the context of Feel the Magic, if you start to see any of these things happening, please report it to your facilitator, and or if you can find me or your head psychologist associated with that camp, please bring us aside, let us know what your concerns are, and we'd be more than happy to help you navigate that or directly work with the child or adolescent to make sure that they remain safe. So that concludes this learning module. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next session.